Good evening, everyone. I'm Zach Stein, Head of Special Collections at Edith Garland Dupre Library, and I welcome you to this week's book discussion hosted by the library. Dupre Library has become an active and vibrant part of the community. We play a large role in disseminating the history and culture of our area, including topics that are current and critical for our community. Our library is rich in resources that support the research needs of our users, and book discussions such as these we are hosting for the next several weeks are one more way we fully support the instructional and research programs of the university and provide access to information to the community. The Who Gets to Vote reading and book discussion series is funded by a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities through the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The series was developed by LEH and is intended to engage members of the public in conversations on the history of voting in the United States. We are happy to have two UL Lafayette faculty scholars to lead these book discussions. Tonight's discussion will be led by Dr. Pearson Cross. Dr. Cross is the Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at UL Lafayette. His principal areas of teaching and research are state and local politics and Louisiana politics. He has published articles and book chapters on topics including redistricting, elections, white supremacy, Southern political culture, and the judiciary. He is nearing completion of a book about education reform in Louisiana, and another book entitled The Party is Over, Louisiana Politics in the 21st Century with Dr. Christy Malloyed, also from UL Lafayette, is under advanced contract with LSU Press. Dr. Cross has a weekly radio show called Bayou to Beltway on KRVS 88.7 FM that focuses on politics and policy and is a frequent commentator on political issues for news media at the national, state, and local levels. Dr. Cross received his BA from San Francisco State University in 1985 and his PhD from Brandeis University in Massachusetts in 1997. Tonight's discussion is of the book One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy by Carol Anderson. This discussion is also being live streamed by AOC Community Media Channel, and this is also available on Dupre Library's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Cross.
Thank you, Zach. It's good to see everyone. I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion. I'd like to thank Dupre Library for hosting this grant, the the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for being the granting agency. Certainly, I'd like to thank everyone who's participated up to this point in one of these very illuminating and entertaining and informative book discussions that we've had. This is the third one here, I believe, and there'll be another one next week led by Dr. Theo Foster. So I hope it's been rewarding. I know I've gotten a lot out of it, even though it came in the middle of a very busy semester, and I know that you all have sacrificed as well to try to get these books read and try to participate in this discussion. And I should point out that right at this moment that we are having a discussion. It is not my intention to lecture, and I'm sure it's not your intention to listen to me lecture. So I would much rather hear what you have to say, and together we'll share and have insights that are different, I hope, in ways, and we'll learn from each other and share our reflections about this very interesting book. With that said, let's start out. So One Person, No Vote. Of course, that's taken from Baker versus Carr, the very famous Tennessee voting rights gerrymandering decision that basically said that as much as possible, one man's vote should equal another man's vote in the language of that day. So right away, we know that something is happening here. So the book's title itself points to the idea that people's vote should be equal. There should be great equality across voting, and the different things that have to do with voting. But right away, Carol Anderson, the author, is making the claim that, in fact, there is no justice in the area of voting. And of course, that's why our book is focused on voting suppression and why one man, one person, and no vote is the outcome. So with that being said, I was hoping to get some general feedback. How did you feel about the book? Was it easy to follow? Did it make arguments that you supported, or did you find yourself questioning what it was saying at different times? And the floor is open, by the way. Who will be the first?
I'll go. I mean, what the book laid out was, I guess for me at least, and I guess any of my contemporaries, if you've done any political science research, was kind of unsurprising. It was refreshing for it to be as contemporary as it was. I think the book going up to all the way to 2018. And I think the book was, as reading wise, I thought it could be a little bit of a slog sometimes, but that's just how this type of book is going to be. Whenever it's just pretty much sitting down, laying out what you would call quote unquote receipts, and just like, here's how it's happening. It's happening, so it just kind of better explains it for you. But overall, I think it's a good book. A book I would definitely recommend any casual political person or anyone that's kind of just has a light curiosity about what's going on with gerrymandering and voter power and voter suppression to read. So I think it's a very informative book, as long as it's not taken as maybe to say the Bible of disenfranchisement. But I think it is a very informative book.
Xavier, if I can follow up, why do you say it shouldn't be taken as the Bible of disenfranchisement?
I mean, to say disenfranchisement is partisan, yes, it's definitely going to be partisan. I just think the book might have been a little bit too partisan for my liking when it comes to it, but it's a partisan topic, right? So you can't not make it a partisan topic. You can't not pick a side almost, it feels like. Sometimes it feels like Carol Anderson throws soft punches a little bit too often for Democratic gerrymandering. I think she only gives New Jersey a precursory look, not anything more. But this book is pretty much about, and if this book is about voter suppression, then you have to, talk about New Jersey if they are suppressing Republican vote. But overall, like I said, enjoyed the book.
Well, I think Xavier has broken the ice and pointed to the elephant in the room. And the elephant in this room is that this is a book that seems to have a go at Republicans in the GOP. How did anyone feel about that?
Yeah, I'll go. I had a couple of thoughts on it. I thought that the arguments were really strong, and it was, really took back the veil of what's going on. For me personally, the chapter that had the most impact was when they were talking about purging the voter rolls. I think there may have been a couple times where I felt that there was maybe kind of like Xavier was saying, like almost like a dig that wasn't needed for the strength of the argument. And so because this has become such a community political discussion in addition to a voting discussion, that jumped out at me as like, oh, okay, that's maybe why some people may be upset. That said, I thought everything that was brought up was really important points that people need to learn about and need to be able to have a really frank discussion with to know these things are happening that are taking away people's rights.
Okay, someone else?
I do kind of agree with both what Xavier and Ann said. I knew a little bit about like the suppression of African-American votes, but I did not know like half of what this book told me. But I did notice a very strong partisan sway in the book. And I feel like that could be off-putting to some readers, which could kind of maybe negate everything she said. Like, they might just be like, oh, it's partisan, I don't want to listen to it. But I think it's a story that needs to be told, and I think it's a really interesting read, even with like maybe the strong partisanship in the book.
I'll go. Strong partisanship or not, I do think that it's important to discuss the methods and the calculated means that these legislators have taken away votes from African Americans, whether what aisle you sit on. I think it's worth noting how they took the votes away. And I don't think that's a partisan thing. I mean, it's targeted against one race.
Well, let me follow up with that. So Josh says targeted against one race. So is voter suppression racially motivated, or is race just a part of it?
Definitely say racially motivated. You could say race plays a part of it, but that's the easy answer. I feel like that's a cop out. It's definitely racially motivated. She goes through to make sure she gives the receipts in the book about multiple times. She shows that this was racially motivated. Maybe not showing what the law would call intent of racially motivation. I don't know what law. That's what I really wish. I wish this kind of book more delved into the law and how the Supreme Court and other justices wrote their opinions backing their decisions to allow or disallow certain things and the animus behind it, because she definitely shows more than once where this has been racially motivated, where certain actors had been caught saying we have to ensure that this, I don't remember the exact quote, but I know there's multiple quotes in the book, and anybody who read the book can for sure remember, I think maybe Wisconsin had a quote. I marked it in the book and I didn't highlight it where it was, but so there's definitely quotes where it has definitely been racially motivated, and to say it's not is, just 100% a cop out to take the easy answer and say it's just politics when that's kind of, that's BS.
Yeah, I would agree that it's mostly racially motivated, and certainly the history of it is almost completely racially motivated. But it kind of seems to me like as we move on, it takes more of like a classist stance, I guess you could say. Whereas it's more against, it targets more poor people, which obviously there's strong like racial there's racial stuff there too, but like for voter ID and stuff like that, I think that can target poor white people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And young people, a lot of the techniques ended up targeting young people, if on purpose or not.
Mm-hmm. One of the things. Go ahead.
I think Mitchell's point is well taken. That the historical tenets certainly are racially motivated, and I was struck consistently, and maybe it's in part because of the earlier books that this group has been reading. Reminds us that this is not a recent phenomenon, and that the tactics and the techniques that were used 200 years ago are reclothed and brought back into today's world. And whether they are portrayed as race neutral at this point in time, there's certainly the tenets are there with a racial edge.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I found a quote talking about the history of disenfranchisement, and it talks about intent. Intent, and I quote, "Intent, of course, was nearly an impossible threshold of proof, requiring racially explicit memos or taped conversations, especially the era that was so consciously colorblind but race aware." And this is when she's talking about politics in Mobile, Alabama, and trying to explain how do you show intent of racial animus or racial specification in the eyes of the law when it comes to disenfranchising someone for voting. And I think that, for me, was the big question I've been trying to deal with about this book, was how do we look at the laws? How does the judiciary decide the judiciary, I don't know if they talk about weight of the vote, because maybe the judiciary doesn't want to get into that, but weight of the vote does matter. So I think that's one of the big questions this book left for me. I don't know about everybody else, but I just how inept the judiciary can be when it comes to dealing with race and voting, or race in general, but race and voting seems to be a very big thing for me. And I think throughout this book is that it's the failure of the law in dealing with this.
Jim, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, a couple of things. First off, I thought that the book had, I think that there are certain proponents of voter suppression that are racist, but there's a lot of other people who go along with it in state legislatures and beyond that I don't think believe themselves to be racist, and I wouldn't consider them to be racist. But the problem is that, I mean, but I think a lot of what, but I do think it's racially motivated to disenfranchise people because they don't share your political views. And I think that, and I am a Republican, disenchanted Republican perhaps these days, but I am just, FYI, I am not that it matters, but I am one. But I think what happens is that a lot of people are sold, everyday people are there's a drumbeat about voter fraud. And I'm not talking about this most recent election with Donald Trump. Obviously, that was an extreme case. But, the book documents well before that there's all these concerns about voter fraud. So I think, rank and file Republicans, when they hear their state legislator talking about, voter fraud or a reason, what's wrong with having someone show an ID? Well, on face value, as the book points out, it doesn't sound like it's that unreasonable until you realize that there's really no voter fraud, and you think through all the difficulties in some states. Like, for example, I remember when one state in the book, they said, in order to get a vote, in order to be able to register to vote, you need a driver's license. And if you don't have a driver's license, you need a birth certificate. To get a driver's license, you need a birth certificate. And to get a birth certificate, you need a driver's license. So it's a vicious circle that people, you shouldn't have to hire a lawyer to go figure out how, to require yourself to require the county registrar to register you. So anyway, I guess there's certainly a lot of racial impact. I think a lot of the reason why ordinary Republicans are, kind of support these kind of laws is because they're misled about voter fraud. And I think a lot of the legislators, while some of them clearly have made racist statements and are probably racist, others are just are into it because of the power dynamic. They just want to retain power, and they're not willing to do it fairly, apparently.
Okay, good. Anyone want to respond to Jim?
I think that the power dynamic that he just mentioned, I think is very real. And I think we've seen that throughout history too, that those in power will do pretty much anything to keep power. And in this case, voter suppression certainly is the methodology that's been being utilized.
If I could add one point here, and I want to go back and pick up the idea of intent. I think it was Xavier that said maybe there was, it's tough to demonstrate intent. Maybe you picked up in the book, there's the 2018 case, Husted versus A. Philip Randolph. It specifically held that past discrimination against minority and other voters is not a consideration in terms of proposed policies or laws, and that in fact, legislatures have to be assumed to be acting in good faith regardless of anything they've done in the past. So if you think about it, this is kind of an extension of Shelby County. So we're throwing out pre-clearance and we're saying, we are not going to prejudge your intent with this particular law that you're passing. We're going to assume that you're not being racist. So I thought it was interesting that the Supreme Court actually came out and said, we're not going to make any assumptions about intent, and you're going to have to show us. Because the thing that the Voting Rights Act, of course, was so controversial about was it was making the pre-clearance counties and states, anytime they made a voting change, take it to the Department of Justice and get it cleared, because the Department of Justice, frankly, thought that they were likely to discriminate. So now that's been removed. So I think one of the things about this current voter suppression debate is that it's very race neutral on its face. Certainly no one's saying, oh yeah, we don't want the African Americans to vote or this or that. You know, that language is not anywhere to be found, right?
I mean, the language is there. I guess it's not explicit enough. I think explicitness has gone a long way to decide intent for when it comes to things like this, you know.
Well, the second section of the Voting Rights Act actually doesn't talk about intent, but it does talk about effect. So if you have a racial impact with regard to the effect of the law, then you can be shown in violation of the Voting Rights Act. But it's not assuming in advance that you are up to no good, right? So yes. It's like case there. I want to go back to Jim and being a Republican. Thanks for outing yourself, Jim. That's a brave thing to do in a book when we've just read a book that seems very anti-Republican, anti-GOP. What do you think is prompting this clinging to the idea of voter fraud among the Republican base? Did you see anything in the book that gave you any insight?
Well, I think if most I would hope, I really think that most ordinary Republican voters would be surprised. Although, you know, I have to say, maybe I'm wrong on that, but because of, you know, there's a lot of Republican voters that seem to raise a lot of issues about this latest election when the Trump organization had many opportunities but failed to actually present any evidence, concrete evidence of voter fraud anywhere. And kind of the same thing happened in 2016 too, right? So, you know, but people tend to still kind of buy into it, even absent any showing of real significant fraud. So I would think that the one thing I think that the book did is synthesize the story across multiple states and showed how different state legislatures, whether it's Indiana or, you know, Wisconsin, places that maybe typically, well, Wisconsin, for example, it's kind of a purple state, I guess. But, you know, how these rules have, as Republicans have been able to take over the governorship and both houses of a state legislature, how they've been able to, you know, implement a bunch of strategies that had the effect of disenfranchising a large number of people, you know, through a scheme that really didn't, and it was people who wouldn't typically vote Republican. So I don't know. I guess in answer to your question, Pearson, I would think that, you know, it certainly was eye-opening. I had already, because of some of the other things that have happened more recently, been a little concerned about, you know, everyone just yelling voter fraud all the time. But, but I thought this book really painted a very thorough and clear message over a long period of time and over a long, contemporary, even in contemporary, I'm talking about, you know, 2010, 2020 era, or 2010 era, that of kind of how widespread it is from Texas to, you know, Wisconsin and just Georgia to, North Carolina, all these different states that have all these different impediments. I think most ordinary Republican voters would be surprised to see that, especially when contrasted to the lack of any merit, pointed out time after time again in the book, lack of any merit for the implementation of all these strict rules when there's not, when there's no real reason to do it, so that, the only obvious reason that it's being done is so that it is to cling to political power, or for some people, if they're racist, to disenfranchise Black people.
Well, I find that interesting because clinging to power and disenfranchising minorities, isn't that kind of two sides of the same coin? That's one thought I had in saying that. And another thought that I had, and I'm not sure if anybody else had this question, how there's different levels of thresholds, right? So the threshold for voter fraud consideration and the serious consideration of it seems so low compared to the threshold that's required to consider discrimination. And I find that inconsistency interesting. I was wondering if anybody else noticed the differences.
Yeah, I think that was a big thing for me too. Whenever I talk about intent on it, and just how do you prove it? You have to jump through 1,001 hoops. They talked about Wisconsin, where they literally did their best to create a formula to explain. This creates a threshold. I think it's 107, 108 maybe. Let's see, 111. If anybody has the book, when they talk about the efficiency gap, an efficiency gap larger than 7% may show that one party holds an unconstitutional systematic advantage over the other. So they've done everything they could to bring the receipts there, and yet that showed what could be considered intent, and yet they still didn't get through the Justice Department, through the Supreme Court. So yeah, I think about that pretty often.
Although what they showed intent for was partisan gerrymandering, right? And that was the question, because if you can successfully show intent with racial gerrymandering, the court's very sympathetic, I think. But the court has said, right, that partisan gerrymandering isn't really susceptible to judicial solutions. So as long as what does that do for voter suppression if the court is not going to look at it from a partisan point of view?
What does that do for the court? If the court's getting partisanly selected, so it's like the court ignores itself.
Those are good points. Other people? Brooke? Dr. Bro, you want to jump in?
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
My headphones weren't working, so. I think it's been, I've agreed with, a lot of things that a lot of people have said so far. And I think a few things that stuck out to me are sort of what I think Vanessa just pointed out, this idea that, it's so easy and so much money spent investigating voter fraud and not finding very much evidence at all in most cases for that happening. And like what the threshold is for, all of the voter suppression issues that come up. And yeah, so that I think I didn't see it that way until Vanessa, you said something, and now I have a good framework for it. I think the other thing that I was thinking early on is my general impression of the book is I didn't think I would ever get so emotional, like both angry and sad, reading a book about voting, right? It really did open my eyes to a lot of issues that I was somewhat aware of, but just didn't. I think the book for me tied the history together. And I saw things that I knew had happened in the past, but linked to things that are still occurring. And that was really powerful for me.
Good. Other people have the same reaction or similar?
Honestly, I wasn't surprised at all by the tactics that the Republican Party has used. I mean, as evidenced by pretty much anything in this country that has been against Black people, I wasn't surprised by the means of how they tried to get Black people not to vote. And I think it's all part of a greater trend of the how America is becoming more diverse. I mean, if you looked at it, I mean, when the book talked about the Lone Star State, Texas, how it's a majority minority state where there's more Hispanics and Blacks over white people, but yet the legislature is controlled by Republicans. And it's controlled by Republicans because they've utilized these tactics to achieve that exact thing.
I appreciate that comment, Josh. But, you know, I was really thinking about this as an overarching arc from the beginning because of some of the other books that we've read. And I think it's really complex. I think at this particular period in time, we're looking at a cross-section where the GOP is using these tactics, but we should not forget that the Democratic Party also used very similar tactics. What I see is a consistent trend where we have a group of elites who engage in various tactics to maintain their advantage and to make sure that their future generations have that advantage. And voting is one of the tools that they've used for it. Democrats have used that pre-1950s. Republicans have seemed to have adopted this strategy going forward. I think what was shocking for me was finding out that our founding fathers, and this was before this book series, that our founding fathers weren't, you know, mom and apple pie and one person, one vote. I think that was the beginning of my disillusionment with the system. So I think it's helpful to think of it. I appreciate your comments, Josh. I think it's helpful for me, at least, to think of it as an arc from the beginning to now. And, you know, again, one of the things that comes to my mind is the motto of the Black Congressional Caucus, which I think really does a good job of encapsulating the African-American experience. They say that they have no permanent friends, they have no permanent enemies, they have permanent issues. And I think that is a really smart way of kind of summarizing their experience, that they can't rely on any consistent allyship as long as they're in a disadvantage, a social, economic, and political disadvantage.
So let's take that on directly. I mean, are Democrats as guilty, or would they be as guilty if they were given the chance to maintain power by some of these strategies?
Absolutely. One of the things that jumped out to me is not just the racial discrimination and disenfranchisement that we saw in there, but that the arc, to use Vanessa's term, all the way from the founders of this concept of the elite, the property owners, the classes, the people who own something. And I think they've referenced it in the book several times that it is they're looking for a quality vote rather than quantity, which means that there are people out there who may not consider it a racist thing, but they think that only those who have attained a certain level of education and understanding of politics and where their taxes go should have any say in voting.
I think it's really, I mean, it's kind of hard. It's like the chicken, what came first, chicken or the egg? I think race is one of the most effective tools used to ensure advantage, because your future generations don't have to be particularly talented. They don't have to particularly excel at anything to maintain the advantage if race is what you're using as one of the things to exclude from opportunity. It's a powerful tool. And, you know, it gets me thinking about how powerful people use different measures to maintain advantage. And I think in the United States, it's particularly difficult to separate race, class, gender from being disenfranchised or from being, I don't know if you can separate that. I think that's an open question. I don't have the answer to it, but it seems to be just interwoven.
Intersectionality, yeah, I agree.
I personally think that the current voter suppression tactics that are being used by whomever, I think it's all just been an evolution of where we've gone from having people enslaved to where we are now, where we have technical voter ID laws that are literally there to prevent voting. It's just an evolution that I think is going on right now.
So it's modern day Jim Crow is what you're saying in some sense.
Yep.
Oh, I think that was very easy to prove when the Native American, when they were talking about the reservations and how you had to have a street, and it's like nobody has streets here. So how are we going to vote? Well, you guys are going to have to just get a street. It's like, how do you just get a, like, I've always lived here. I just live in the corner of the blue house and the red one. How do I just get a street? How do you get a street? Has anybody here decided to like figure out how to get a street? Could you just imagine trying to say, all right, now I got to figure out what this street is. Like, I just got to get a street. I've never had this. I don't even know if they had the infrastructure to do that. Like, these streets weren't named. We didn't do this. So now we got to officially start planning this out. That is, the levels people have to go through and jump through to vote is insane. Once again, this book talks about it a lot. Is voting a right or a privilege? I thought we just fully decidedly said that voting is a right in America. So if that's a right, it should be protected. Obviously, it's not. Before I start ripping off on that.
I keep coming back to the discussion point in the book that described the recent or more recent evolution of the voter suppression as an instrument to maintain power, and that being the notion that it was Southern strategy, and that it was a partisan decision by a party that was finding itself lacking and needing to resurrect itself. And so it adopted a technique that had been used very successfully, obviously, with the Mississippi Plan, in terms of you just keep people who aren't going to vote like you from voting. And it worked. And they have currently, the Republican Party has been the one who has foisted this upon, the electorate. To your question, Dr. Cross, does that then portend that, if roles were reversed, or if there is would a democratic circumstance adopt similarly? And I think the answer would be yes, given what we have seen or in history. And Vanessa referenced it in terms of way back. The elites or those in power are going to have historically shown and continue to show that whatever is necessary to stay in control will be tactics that will be used.
I think it is interesting, though. Has anybody pondered the question of both of the parties took a different strategy, and they flip-flopped in strategy over time. But I find it interesting that the Democrats took the approach where they were going to expand their platform to encompass issues and ideas and policies that would help a broader spectrum of people. And the GOP adopted a strategy that if all else fails, we're going to fix the rules in the case of voter suppression. So I find it would the Democrats do the same thing? Well, actually, that question, that is an empirical question that's kind of been answered. They chose to expand their platform to be a more progressive, populist, not populist, I don't think that's the right word, but a platform that seemed to encompass more of the issues of these different emerging populations. And the GOP decided to go in a different direction. What would be interesting is to understand why they made those choices. Why did the Democrats compete on ideas and the GOP decide on a strategy of excluding people from participating? I think that's an interesting question for me that would be cool to kind of understand.
Vanessa, if I can add something here, and I hear what you're saying, and I think there's, it's well said, but there's also the example that the Democratic Party found that it was able to demonize a piece of its supporters, and I'm referring to the 1994 law enforcement acts and some of the things passed by Clinton that, in fact, produced an enormous wave of felons, and the explosion helped produce the explosion of people in the penitentiaries across the United States. And those people now can't vote. So there's a sense in which when beating up on Black people, would pay off at the polls, and Clinton found that very easy to do and got elected twice to do it. And the nation's still struggling with a prison population of 2.3 million. And the estimation right now is somewhere between 5.3 and 7 million Americans are currently denied voting because they have a felony conviction, or they're in the prisons or the jails. So I would agree with you generally in terms of expanding the electorate, but at times, in order to stay in power, and I think that's how Clinton saw it, the Democrats made decisions to limit the electorate. So I wish that were not the case, perhaps, but.
So what we're seeing here again is class and race intersecting, where the lowest class and who happens to be in the lowest rung getting screwed again in democracy. I think we were kind of leaving the book a bit. I think for me, another question was, how do we deal with in states that have these metropolises where majority of people live, and these metropolises where the majority of people live may also happen to be majority minority, getting absolutely destroyed in state politics just because of, the rural power there is. Because until we fix that, I don't know if there's any fixing everything else. At least for me, that was one of the big things for me, was seeing that when we look at Milwaukee, and it's like most of the people live in Milwaukee. Milwaukee has the most people and everything else. But you look at the state electorate, because there's so many counties, there's nobody in there, but they end up pretty much getting outrepresented in state electorates and state senates and state votes. And then these state electorates end up gerrymandering the big cities to hell and back, to where they have one polling place for, millions of people, to where they pretty much stay in power, and you end up with a red Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to interrupt. John Basin, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
I did. I wanted to add in to the point that Dr. Cross put up about the prisoners or ex-cons that weren't allowed to vote. It's similar to how earlier in the book it talks about, even if people were passing the literacy test and there'll be other stipulations to prevent them from having their rights to vote. And prisoners are capable of comprehending certain pieces of academic writings and stuff like that. They're fully functioning adults who should have the right to vote, but parties see them as a threat depending on their ethnicity and things of that nature. That's all. I was just agreeing with Dr. Cross.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. Good point. Xavier, I want to go back to your point about representation. So this is really kind of at the heart, isn't it, of what we're talking about? We're talking about who gets represented and how fairly. And so when you're talking about an urban district where you have lots and lots of minorities, and you say, okay, well, are they voting? And what happens when that urban district gets outvoted by the downstate people that are majority white? And is that a challenge for our particular system, or is it is it something that political elites look to game and try to prevent, depending on which side they're on, the fair representation and distribution of power?
Yeah, that's something the book really, I think, wrestled with. I didn't really wrestle with. I wrestled with the book. I don't think the book really talked about it, but we didn't. You have to ask. In the United States, we're not a direct democracy. As a minority member, I think we understand that pretty well. But have we taken too much power away from major city centers to give to rural people? Because that's kind of why states end up all red, because, there's these major city centers where all the people live, and there's 30 other counties where there's 3,000 people who, they have representation, but do they have too much power and too much representation, I guess? is one of those big questions for me in this book.
Xavier, I have to do a fact check on you here. So ever since Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims, states are required by the Supreme Court decisions to have representative districts and Senate districts that are equal within plus or minus 5%. So they can have a 5% variance. So one district could vary by 10% in population from another district. But if it varies more than that, then they're setting themselves up for a court case and they would lose. So that's the standard right now. So the overrepresentation of rural districts used to be a really, really serious problem in this country, but it's not so much any longer. Now, that doesn't say anything about gerrymandering, right? But it does say that districts have to be equal in population.
Can we talk about, I mean, upon reading this book, I did some research and I keep going back to the state of Texas because of the massive population centers that it has. Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. So many people in America live in those cities. And to me, Houston is going to be the third largest city in the next years. But anyways, the constituency that surrounds the city, Corpus Christi. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about Texas, but Corpus Christi is a majority Hispanic district. And the district is so gerrymandered to where that the electorate there, which are predominantly Democrats, they have no representation because the district is gerrymandered to take rural areas away from Corpus Christi. And so the city of Corpus Christi has no democratic representation. And I'm not saying it should be democratic, but I'm saying if you study factions and you study, like, if you know about Latinos or anything, they generally speaking vote Democratic, but that goes on in Texas all the time. And that's just how they gerrymander these districts. And I think it's District 27, Texas District 27, I looked up.
Austin is another good example of that, you know, where you grab a slice of urban Austin and then tie it to the surrounding countryside. But remember, as long as you can make an argument that you're doing that for partisan purposes and not for racial purposes, the Supreme Court has said it's okay.
But what about when partisan and race are hand in hand, like it is a lot of times?
Yes.
Well, and one thing I would love to explore a little bit is the philosophical question of why and when intent matters. You know, and I can see on, you know, just to share the thoughts I've had on it so far, although it's very much something information, you know, I can see on a personal level when you're judging yourself and you're like, oh, was I right or was I wrong? Sometimes if the intent wasn't bad, you might be able to say, oh, that wasn't a good thing to do, or that had a bad outcome, but I didn't mean badly by it. So you can, you know, soothe yourself with that, I suppose. But like from a public policy perspective, if you implement, and I'm going to pick on the younger voters, because I don't necessarily think if there is intent that the younger voters are the ones that were meant to disenfranchise, as well as the elderly. However, both of those groups have ended up disenfranchised by these rules. And so, I mean, but the fact that they're disenfranchised, in my mind, like that's still, like, that is the problem, not the intent of it. So I guess I just wanted to like throw out the philosophical question of when and where and how does an intent matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good.
Seems like intent's 3/5 of the law.
Xavier, I think, said something that he was kind of a throwaway statement, but he said, of course, if you're a Black person, you live in America, you know about, you know, America is not a perfect democracy. But what do you think about being described by international organizations as a flawed democracy? I mean, the United States is described, generally speaking, as a flawed democracy, ranked way down the list on most democratic measures for our lack of participation, our exclusionary voting practices, our registration requirements, our gerrymandering, the amount of times we let minorities rule majorities and the rest. I mean, how does that make us feel? I mean, did you get that while you were reading this book?
I mean, it's unsurprising. There's no, it's not like it's surprising to, I guess, maybe to other readers, but to me, and I think probably any other Black person on this poll or this talk would not be surprised. We realize the history of America. So, I mean, that's at least for me, very unsurprising.
Yeah. I thought it was quite embarrassing for us to be at the bottom of the list. Well, not at the top. I just thought it was embarrassing to be in comparison with other industrialized nations that we're not on the same level when it was just quite out embarrassing when other countries have what we don't.
I think it's an opportunity because up until this point, we've lived with this idea of American exceptionalism. Yeah. And I think that if we can begin to have some real change, if there is a full recognition and acknowledgement that thing that we're known for, we have never really done as well as we should. And I think having that external proof, because we've always, had this attitude, we're number one, we're the best in the world, we're the most free place to live on the planet. I think having that external, I don't know if I want to say stamp or reprimand a little bit, and it shows something where we're not number one, especially when it comes to something that's supposed to be at the core of our identity. I think it could be useful if the right people are paying attention. But I mean, for people who are earnest and have been struggling with these issues for quite some time, like Xavier and you have pointed out, this wasn't surprising to you. No blinders were removed from your eyes. Part of this is because you and our families have lived this experience. This is the experience that's been passed on to us. This knowledge has been passed on to us. So, I mean, there's no shock there. But I think it's a real opportunity if everyone is open to receiving that and then applying kind of that can-do spirit we claim that we have to change. But it all depends on who's going to listen to the message and who's going to move to do something about it.
Right. I like the optimism of Ms. Hill's answer. There certainly is something that we should take accountable as citizens. And me personally, as a political science major, I've been taking a lot of history and a lot of political sciences, and it really has shown me some things that just my general education from high school and my supplemental things that I thought I was finding answers to, I've been finding out more from college and whatnot. And I feel like if more people push themselves to find out truths or just look at the available knowledge, we can see where we are lacking and take it as a challenge and try to push ourselves to compete with those greater democracies like Finland or some of those European countries that have just better communications and better systems between their citizens and governments.
I want to echo that I went to a very dark place around the comparison to Venezuela. And so I loved Vanessa turning that on its head and giving that optimistic approach and and buying into what we see as our ideal, could be some real unifying language. So that said, where my head went, the dark place is, just with how polarized our society has become, and the trend lines continue to become more polarized. And Venezuela, of course, is a democracy, or I'm not sure if they're in civil war or failed state. I don't know the exact political science term, but given where they're at, and they're definitely a country where we can see some parallels. And so just hearing yet again another parallel, and having that parallel being on something that we thought we were getting right, or a lot of people thought we were getting right. Nope, not doing good there either. And just like this other country that's in a rough spot right now. So,
yeah, I want to push back a little bit on that, on the concept where we're talking about truth. I don't know if truth actually matters anymore, or if it ever really did matter. It's not like Black people haven't been saying we've been disenfranchised. We've been saying it for a long time, and we've had the receipts for it for a long time. So I don't know how much truth matters to it all, or like bringing illumination to it. If we're going to look at the real world about it, I mean, truth didn't matter for the last election. You still have the narrative that you have around it. I think what's his name brought it up. Jim brought it up about the narratives around the last election, and narratives around voter disenfranchisement. But it's around illegal voting. There's not a single piece of evidence that it happens. There's a lot of evidence that it doesn't happen, but yet the truth has still not, found its way to the forefront. So I think we have to really look at how do we want to make real world change. So how do we start to affect real world change when I guess truth may not matter to it?
Maybe I'm not seeing a good pattern, because I mean, history is not my area of expertise. Neither is political science. I don't even play that on TV, so I'm going to limit that there. And full disclosure, I don't study it. But what I have been seeing as a pattern is when changes happen, it's come after an embarrassment, right? So Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act of 1965 came after we were embarrassed. Abroad, they could no longer talk about democracy, and they could no longer talk about those things with any credibility when it was so obvious that they were not engaging in respecting people's human rights and not engaging in those kind of policies at home. So that is the context of which I put that this is an opportunity with having that flawed democracy. If it is embarrassing, because it seems like that seems to happen right before a real change happens, then perhaps that is a path to nudging some kind of change, because it certainly didn't happen with reason and logic for any of the advances that have happened before in the past. It seems like what happened is, wow, we're really embarrassed, and we don't want to be embarrassed anymore, so we got to step up. But again, I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing that trend correctly.
But was
Vicki, go ahead.
Was it external embarrassment, though, in the 60s and the civil rights that caused the change, or the shock that citizens of this country themselves saw about our own behavior? I'm with you that I think big change happens when things really start to expand and grow and it gets scary, and that's what causes the big change. I'm concerned, though, in a country that so easily believes in just the concept of voter fraud that hasn't been proven, that we are somehow going to be able to disprove the trope that they have been taught all the way through school about how great this country is from the get-go, and that's all we hear. And unlearning that concept seems to me much harder than learning a phrase, there was voter fraud.
If I could jump in just for a second, it occurred to me as you all were speaking that, I don't want to talk about Donald Trump very much, because it's easy to talk about him, and we could talk about Donald Trump all night. But, his slogan, "Make America Great Again," I think it's clear after reading this book and what's been going on is that that slogan calls for voter suppression and calls for a return to an America in which minorities had less power and less voice. And so what we see is a definition of America as a less inclusive community, certainly where people who have been voting don't vote anymore or have less power. So in that context, it seems like if there's an opportunity, it would be to reshape what making America great again would mean. And that might mean expanding the people who participate and really achieving that democracy and that opportunity that you're talking about, Vanessa. But I do think it's going to be very uphill, because the person who defines what made America great first typically is going to be hard to displace.
And I'd just like to circle back to what Dr. Hill was saying. And I feel like we do make lots of changes when we're compared to other places, like the big movements in the civil rights in the 60s and stuff, because the USSR was promoting this great idea of we have this socialism and everybody's equal. So I think that America got a little nervous and they were like, well, our African Americans don't have that. So they're going to want to advocate for that. And so I think they started making changes then. So if we start comparing ourselves to nations that don't have that freedom, I think it might push a little bit for that stick to your identity and reclaim that freedom and make your votes count again, I think.
Okay.
I'm unmuted. I keep circling back to the embarrassed. Embarrassed by whom? Who were the actors? You know, because I kind of agree, but for me, it's like what exact outside pressures and quote unquote embarrassments paved the way for America to change. Is it, if it happens to be just other European countries, then that's really sad for any Black or brown person here, because it means that they have to be embarrassed by other white countries to feel like they have to change. I could be wrong. Somebody has maybe a global pressure, but for me, that's what the embarrassment comes from. It was, you know, Europe was so embarrassed. Look at us, and look how embarrassed we are. Then, you know, so that's my big pushback on that one too. Just on that piece for y'all.
Yeah.
Oh, and I guess we can rip off the book. What do you guys think about what happened in Georgia, even with everything that has been talked about in Ms. Anderson's book about the length Brian Kemp went through and Brad Raffensperger went through to disenfranchise the Black vote, to still end up voting blue for Joe Biden in 2020. Anybody have opinions on that? I think that's a very interesting outcome. The amount of work that went into Georgia was absolutely amazing. Stacey Abrams is usually who we talk about, but you know, there's more than Stacey Abrams. There are a lot of people at work there. So does anybody have any big ideas or opinions on the amount of work you have to do to get any type of voter, the equal vote to work, or B, just the results? Or maybe you feel the opposite.
Well, that's where I was kind of trying to go with the concept of it's more internal embarrassment that causes the populace to act than external foreign country embarrassment, because I think the last 4 years, maybe longer than that, has energized people, both the people who went out and were the workers to help get the votes in, and the people who came out of the woodwork who had not voted for many years or at all to vote. It was more internal embarrassment of looking at ourselves as opposed to how does the rest of the world think about us.
I think it's effective. I'm not really concerned where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Anderson said that there's 76 million Americans who are eligible to vote but are not registered. That's 31% of Blacks, 43% of Asians, 42% of Latinos, and 27% of white voters. So that's an extraordinary number of eligible people who are not registered. You know, so I think Georgia, the lesson from Georgia is that if you invest in getting people to vote, they will vote. And it is possible to overcome voter suppression if you work hard enough. Of course, I think we all believe you shouldn't have to work that hard just to get people to vote, but it certainly pointed the way forward. I mean, maybe that's what we all need to make as our mission. We should all join the League of Women Voters, which is, I'd like to point out, I'm a member, please join. Sign up people to vote.
One of the things that jumped out at me as well was the League of Women Voters in the book about how I think it was Mississippi that made the laws so strict that even the League of Women Voters was worried to do the voter registration drives. But then, there's such a group of action that then they also sued the state at the same time for that. So, and I would say too, one of the things that I didn't realize that I learned from the book is, not only the individual disenfranchisement, but all the laws that have been made to keep efforts, like to keep voter registration drives from happening, or like making voting a felony if you do XYZ thing wrong. So like there was some fear tactics in there that were really, really disturbing and top of everything else.
Yeah.
I'd seen parallels too in the discussion of Roy Moore in Alabama and sort of what ended up happening in Georgia, where there was, a lot of push and effort and media and, all of this surrounding the elections. And so I felt like there were some similarities there from the book to what we were recently seeing. And it always circles back to me to the question of how do we combat this? Like, the system seems very broken, and it seems, the more I think about it and think about the details, like, yes, we can do local things like that were described, like that happened in Georgia, and get people out and get people to vote. But there are still barriers, there are still hurdles, and that's a lot of individuals' time, effort, money being put toward that goal where we could make it easier, right? But I don't know how we get there, right? And so I feel like it's such a big issue, and I don't have any of the answers in that realm. But it always kind of circles back to me, to that question.
That's a great question, and one that we might take away from this discussion, and that is, after reading this book, how did it change us, and what are we going to do to promote voting in this country and make it easier and better for people to vote? Do you have any answers to that question? What are you going to do? Assuming that you were impelled to action by reading this book.
I think I personally felt like I should be doing something, right? And that I can be doing something, and that I probably have not been, doing my part, at least at the local level, and where I can feel like I'm effective. So I think things like, joining groups like the League of Women Voters, joining with other people, right, who have the same sort of goals and ideas could be really helpful and useful. And I think having discussions like this helps us to see that there are people out there who have similar, goals in mind, and we could work together, and we could do this here. And if we can do it here, then we can show others how to do it elsewhere, and maybe that starts something.
That's good. Someone else?
I'll go too. I personally think you shouldn't have to work that hard, like, to get people to vote. It shouldn't be that hard to vote. We've said this multiple times. It shouldn't be that hard to vote, and in some places, it's impossible. In Texas, Houston, the humongous city, had one drop box to early vote. One drop box, you shouldn't have to be that hard. So for me, I think one of the best things you could do is just, I forgot what was in the book. It wasn't get mad. But for me, it's that. Get mad, stay mad, tell everybody you know, and make sure that you are creating public pressure. I think that's one of the best things you could do, especially when the truth doesn't matter. Public pressure matters than anything. So one of my big things is just get mad, stay mad, get the information out, and do your best to create as much public pressure as possible, because it's legal to do. It's legal to disenfranchise is what we've gotten. So so if you can make public pressure, I think that's your best hope for change, or my best hope for change is public pressure. Because the amount of work and economic time you have to put in to get people to vote is untenable to do every 2 years if you're running for House. As somebody who's worked for a House election, that is insane to do that every 2 years. So I think it just has to come down to public pressure.
And I think one good way of supplying that public pressure is doing like Ms. Bro said, just like joining those groups and advocating and helping as many people as possible to vote. I mean, when I read this book, it encouraged me to like do more, because I realized that it may be easy for me to vote, but it's not easy for everybody to vote. So you should join groups and do whatever you can to ensure that this right stays a right and not a privilege.
I think there are some good, I think we look for common interests among different groups that we could leverage those relationships with. I think back, I've been trying to read about what people did previously. So these books tell us a lot about the obstacles that were thrown in people's way, and it mentions the successful organization that people did to combat it. I would have loved to hear more detail about what their tactics were, what their strategies were to do it. Because I'm from the outside looking in and I have to piece together what they tried to do. But, they were very effective. I think, when people started seeing themselves reflected in a platform, that they could move towards making some significant change. So I guess what I would do, because I'm in the field of business and I try to do this all the time, is I try to educate managers and business people about sustainable practices, inclusive practices. So we can't get the legislators to do it, but what if we could get businesses to give their employees the day off to go vote on election day? What if we could have businesses sponsor transportation of their employees in some sort of that don't have cars or what have you to go to the polls? In our areas of discipline and influence, we may be able to find good relationships that we could use to get things advanced.
Quick comment on that. Maybe 2 years ago in the city of Lafayette, maybe that was 4, we tried to have public buses take people to go vote, and that quickly got struck down as illegal use of public funds to take people to the polls. I also wouldn't be surprised if businesses did start helping that. It would soon be illegal for businesses to help people to get to the polls. The justice system has me so upset. This book, that's what this book did for me. It made me really upset at the courts, Supreme Court especially, for calling itself nonpartisan. It is as partisan as it gets. Whenever Justice Alito goes talk to the Federalist Society, come on. You can't get more partisan.
One of the things that I think, ever since the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed, I think a lot of people thought that the struggle for inclusive voting in this country was over. And if anything that we've seen by reading this book, this struggle is not over. It's a generational struggle, and particularly, as you pointed out, with the courts, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, this is going to have to be the struggle for the next 25 years to make voting, the ability to vote, and all people voting just a right as much as speech or anything else. And it's not going to come easy. So to me, this is the great unfinished work of America, frankly.
Yeah, and if I could just guess, that it was very likely, part of the reason why that this book, in spite of having a little political tense at some point, is so important in this voting rights discussion that's taking place.
Mm-hmm. One way. Go ahead.
I was just going to say to that point, and I think I heard Ann correctly, that given the fact that HR 1 is sitting there right now and that the focus is there, I think as an individual, I have the responsibility to certainly encourage my elected officials to vote for it, recognizing that in all likelihood, those representing Louisiana are not going to be inclined to necessarily do so. That said, I think that it is still incumbent upon us to express ourselves in that way. Probably more importantly will be to look from a Louisiana standpoint at the upcoming census results and the redistricting that is going to take place this year. That is an opportunity to express ourselves, to engage, to talk to officials, to again, continue to talk. I'm not Pollyannish. I understand, political realities in terms of immediate impact, but I think that there's a long term that you can play to as well. I think it's acknowledging persons who do vote or support voting rights that you campaign for, you contribute to, you write letters of support and acknowledge that. I don't think we do enough of that, quite frankly. There are little things that I think in the long run can help make a difference. I think timing really does matter. I think we're at a really unique time and opportunity here with this HR 1 circumstance and with the way that the Democrats are currently capable of voting both the Senate and the House in favor of it if certain things go right, which then brings up this whole question on filibuster. And that's another political argument, but it certainly is something that we should be attuned to, talking about, working towards, writing Joe Manchin and saying, hey, now's the time. At least on this issue, let's do what's right.
Can someone give a 10,000-foot view of HR 1?
HR 1 is something, so somebody else jump in if you feel better qualified. HR 1 would do a number of things. It would, to facilitate voting, it would change the way districts are drawn in the United States. It would change the way elections are funded. It would establish all kinds of things about making it easy to vote. It's an incredibly wide-reaching bill. It's kind of like a wish list for everything you ever wanted about an election to clean up American politics, all wrapped into one bill. And it's extremely controversial on a number of levels. And it's as it is, nobody thinks it's going to pass the Senate. The question would be, can it be shaped in such a way that some parts of it could get through the Senate, and that's an open question, I think, at this point. But it would be the single most important piece of voting legislation since the Voting Rights Act, no doubt about it.
Thank you.
If I could point out an opportunity, redistricting is coming up this year in Louisiana. There's going to be a special session, and we've had a number of conversations at this discussion about redistricting and how that works to disadvantage or advantage people or leave people where their vote doesn't count. So you might start thinking about what it would take for you to get involved in redistricting. Typically, the legislature goes around the state and hears from citizens about redistricting and the process. They explain the process. So you have an opportunity as a citizen to input. You can testify to the legislature as an expert witness. So educate yourself and get ready to participate in that discussion. I think it would be important. I noticed that the Brennan Center seems to be, are you familiar with the Brennan Center? They're a center that's devoted to expanding and furthering voting in the United States. And it's not a center perhaps that's that well known, but as I bounced into, as I started bumping into them again and again, I started thinking, man, it's the Brennan Center for Justice. It's at New York University Law School, and they're really focused on voter suppression and ending voter suppression. So if you really want to get involved with a national organization that's dealing with that issue, I would recommend the Brennan Center. And I'll put it down in the chat. The thing about these grassroots level, you may be thinking, well, what I do won't have much effect on anything. But, you know, the movement to protect gun rights in the United States and the movement to make abortion illegal in the United States have both been grown from the grass up and by people who are partisan and dedicated. And those have been very successful movements, regardless of how you feel about them. So maybe a citizens movement to promote voting rights is what's needed in this case.
Also financially well backed.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Your comment about one person and the impact and effect. One of the things I took away from the book was the number of times where a single individual had control of the destiny of something very significant. I mean, Jeff Sessions, you know, in Alabama was pointed to as a single individual whose philosophy or ideology, John Roberts' circumstance and where he came. I mean, it just struck me how, you know, an individual can impact so much. And so I guess I would say, why can't it be one of us in some circumstance to keep putting ourselves in positions to potentially or supporting others that might get into that circumstance? The Secretary of State in Florida, elected official who made extraordinary decisions that impacted the presidential election. I mean, you stop to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just, there are reasons to stay active and work on that one at a time philosophy.
Especially the students that are here on this discussion, you know, it's not, you know, the kind of successes that you're referring to, Mr. Clark, are not preordained, you know, so they happen because people worked hard and learned about issues and got involved. So there's no reason why our students, the people in this discussion, can't be at a crucial point in the future at some point.
I think it's hard for me to think about a single individual as like somebody who gets elected, though. You know, it wasn't a single individual that put Josh, who was a Supreme Court justice in power, or Lindsey Graham, you know, John Roberts, you know, so I mean, a lot of complicity goes into this too. So I think sometimes we have to also remember that single individual had a lot of support and backers. Lindsey, how many times Lindsey Graham has been reelected now?
5.
To the Senate. So he's running 5 times Senate, 5 times Senate. And isn't that 6 years? That's, you know, 30 years of getting reelected. John Roberts got appointed. So I want to push back on the single individual thing and make sure we realize how complacent everyday actors are. For me, at least, that's really big, is remember complacency, how that plays into it.
Well, I've enjoyed the discussion today. Is there anybody who would like to say a few things about the book before we move on, or say something about the book that's coming up next week if you're continuing into next week's discussion? Have we all arrived at some great truth and now we are sitting back and basking in that knowledge? Is that what's going on?
No, for me, I think I'm processing more questions. You know, I think I have more questions than I had going into it. And, you know, I think Xavier's point brings some balance. One person can make a difference, but there's plenty of people who have tried individually to push for change and have been unsuccessful because they haven't had support. They haven't had people with resources behind them. So for the couple of grassroots movements you point out, I thought I heard Xavier saying that there's a lot of money behind them. we do have to recognize that people are more successful if they have resources and if they have the support that comes with that. So I guess the question is where do you begin when you are not in a position of power? You don't represent a group that has power, and you don't have alliances with people who have power. So then what is it? What are the tactics of the people who don't have that advantage to make a change? Which is, again, that question I keep coming to, where they talk about these obstacles, they talk about the people who are successful, but I would love to know more about strategies that these folks used to offset the imbalance of power and resources they had.
Well, of course, I'm thinking about MLK and Gandhi as examples of people who really didn't have much when they started out, but were, you know, extraordinary in terms of their influence, you know. I mean, it's certainly not guaranteed that anyone's going to have a success, but nobody ever succeeded at anything they didn't try, you know. So in this case, I mean, the cause is just, right? Voting is central to democracy and our conception of rule consent of the governed. So we have nothing to lose but our chains in this case, or our blinders, to paraphrase someone else.
Xavier's point about money and dollars is well taken. To that end, I think it's, again, if I'm not mistaken, HR 1 addressed as campaign financing. And I think that that's another, you know, whole area that we need to be very conscious of and understand how that has changed, you know, recently, and has certainly impacted the ability of many to feel as though they are participating or have an impact or effect. No question. And Dr. Cross, just as a summative, I want to thank you and Dupre Library and whoever else for, again, putting this on. I find these weekly conversations therapeutic. I am in awe of the intellect of some of the student voices that I'm hearing. As skeptical and cynical as I can become, I am encouraged that there are thought processes that are taking place in a way that I think is going to benefit all of us. So thank you all.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Mr. Clark. Any other closing remarks? Ms. Ellis, I'll turn it over to you, I think. Vicki, did you have your hand up or was that clapping?
Clapping.
Ah, okay.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. In the chat, there is a link to a survey that we would like you to take on behalf of the funding organization for this grant, LEH. And they would like you to do the survey. So if you could please do that before you go. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for coming and for your participation.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, next week, the next book is Bending Toward Justice by Gary May, and that will be facilitated by Dr. Theodore Foster. So that's March 31st, starting at 6:30.
Are there still spots for some of the other ones?
For the next one coming up, if you email me, I can check when I get back to work.
All right, great.
It's just Tiffany Ellis, tiffany.ellis@louisiana.edu.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'm also extremely grateful, especially to my political science teacher, Dr. Cross, for inviting me and opening this opportunity for me. That's all I have to say now. This is a great experience.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fun, and I've enjoyed hearing all your viewpoints, and I know you're going to make a difference. So I'm excited to see what you guys are going to put together and think about as we go forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a great rest of the week.